At 22 minutes past 8 this morning, a piece of seafloor between South America and Antarctica moved sideways. Magnitude 6.2, 10 kilometres down, in an ocean so empty that the nearest city is 850 miles away. No damage, no tsunami, nobody hurt. On the standard scorecard, a non-event, except that it happened 67 kilometres from the epicentre of the largest earthquake this ocean has ever recorded, and the last time this fault produced a moderate quake on that side, it followed with a magnitude 7.8 4 days later. A National Research Institute has stated in public that events of exactly this type here can destabilise the fault segments next door, and there is not one instrument standing on this plate. Its only way of speaking is to break. This morning it spoke, so is this the warning, or is it nothing? If that has your attention, hit the like button and subscribe to the Skylab, because I am going to be tracking this sequence every day that it develops. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from, and whether you have ever felt an earthquake yourself. Now, let's get into it. Part 1, 8:22 in the morning. At 22 minutes past 8 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time on Saturday, August 22nd, 2026, a piece of the seafloor between South America and Antarctica moved sideways. The United States Geological Survey put it at magnitude 6.2. The European Mediterranean Seismological Centre, working from a partly different set of stations on a partly different set of assumptions, arrived at the same number. Both agencies placed it at a depth of 10 kilometres, which is about 6.2 miles down. The event was assigned a catalogue identifier, filed, and pushed out to the automated feeds that carry earthquake information around the world in the first few minutes after the ground moves. Then almost nothing happened, which is exactly what you would expect. There were no reports of shaking because there was no one there to feel it. The Geological Survey ran its automated impact assessment and returned a green alert for shaking-related fatalities and a green alert for economic losses, which is the lowest category the system produces. It means a low likelihood of casualties. It means a low likelihood of damage. 7 minutes after the earthquake, at 29 minutes past 8, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center issued a statement confirming that based on all available data, there was no tsunami threat. The nearest towns were not close in any sense that matters. The epicenter sat 1,330 kilometers east-southeast of Tolhuin, Argentina, 1,368 kilometers east-southeast of Ushuaia, a city of just under 57,000 people that markets itself, accurately, as the southernmost city in the world, 1,406 kilometers east-southeast of Rio Grande. In miles, that is roughly 850 miles of open southern ocean, between this earthquake and the last place where a significant number of human beings live. So on the standard scorecard, this was a non-event. Moderate magnitude, empty ocean, no tsunami, no damage, nobody hurt. There are between 100 and 150 earthquakes of this size somewhere on Earth every single year, and the overwhelming majority of them happen exactly like this one did. Underwater, unwitnessed, and unremembered. I want to tell you why I think this one is different, and I want to do it with a single number. The epicenter of this earthquake was located at approximately 60.379 degrees south, 47.605 degrees west. On the 17th of November 2013, at 4 minutes and 55 seconds past 9 in the morning, Universal Time, an earthquake struck at 60.27 degrees south, 46.40 degrees west. Run the great circle arithmetic between those 2 points, and you get a separation of about 67 kilometers, 42 miles. That's a comfortable morning's drive. It is the width of a mid-sized metropolitan area. On the scale of a plate boundary that runs for well over 1,000 kilometers, 67 kilometers is the same neighborhood, and the earthquake that happened at that second set of coordinates in 2013 was a magnitude 7.8. That is the largest earthquake ever recorded in this region, since instruments began watching it. Not the largest in a decade, not the largest since the last big one, the largest in the entire instrumental history of this stretch of ocean, which at the time ran back more than 50 years. It was also the third largest earthquake anywhere on the planet in 2013, in a year that included some very substantial competition. The energy difference between the two events is not a small thing, and I want you to actually feel it, rather than nod at it. Earthquake energy scales as roughly a factor of 32 for every full step in magnitude. the gap between magnitude 6.2 and magnitude 7.8 is 1.6 magnitude units. Multiply that out, and today's earthquake released something in the neighbourhood of 1/350th of the energy of the 2013 event. If the 2013 earthquake were a stick of dynamite, this morning's earthquake would be a firecracker sitting 42 miles down the road from it. So no, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that a magnitude 6.2 is a big earthquake, because it is not. What I'm going to tell you is that it happened in a very specific place, and that place has a history, and that history has a shape, and the shape of it is the reason I have spent today looking at this instead of at anything else that happened on Earth this week. Because here is the part that stopped me. The 2013 earthquake did not arrive out of a clear sky. It was not a bolt from nowhere. It was the end of a sequence that had already been running for 4 days, and the sequence had a direction. On Wednesday, the 13th of November 2013, a magnitude 6.1 struck approximately 50 kilometres to the west of the coordinates where the great earthquake would eventually be centred. 2 days later, on Friday the 15th, a magnitude 6.8 struck very close to that first event. Then, on Sunday the 17th, the fault gave way properly and produced the magnitude 7.8. Read that again with today's numbers in your head. In 2013, the sequence opened with a moderate earthquake about 50 kilometres west of the eventual main shock. Today, a moderate earthquake occurred about 67 kilometres west of that same main shock epicentre, same fault system, same side, comparable offset, comparable magnitude. I want to be extremely careful here, because this is precisely the point where a channel like this one can either do something genuinely useful or do something irresponsible. And the difference between those two things is about 4 sentences of honesty. So here they are. This does not mean a magnitude 8 is coming. It does not mean a magnitude 7 is coming. Most earthquakes of this size are followed by nothing at all except a quiet decaying tail of smaller aftershocks that nobody outside a university seismology department ever notices. The overwhelmingly likely outcome of today, if I had to bet, is that in 3 weeks this is a line in a catalogue and nothing more. But unlikely is not the same as meaningless. And the reason this one is not meaningless is that we are not looking at a random piece of oceanic crust. We are looking at a mapped, named, well-studied plate boundary that has demonstrated twice in the last 23 years that it is capable of producing earthquakes in the 7.6 to 7.8 range. That is not a hypothetical capability inferred from a model. That is a measured capability, recorded by instruments, published in journals, sitting in the catalogue right now. There is a phrase that geologists use that I think is the single most useful idea in all of hazard science, and it is the difference between what is likely and what is possible. Almost nothing that is possible is likely on any given day. But the possible things do not stop being possible just because they are unlikely, and the only honest way to think about a fault like this one is to hold both of those facts at the same time without letting either of them eat the other. So that is what we are going to do. We are going to look at exactly what broke this morning, and I mean exactly, because the shape of the break tells you an enormous amount about what kind of fault we are dealing with and what it can and cannot do to you. We are going to go back to November of 2013 and walk through those 4 days properly, because there is a statement in the official record from that week that I think is the most important sentence anyone has written about this plate boundary, and almost nobody has read it. We're going to look at a scientific paper from 2014 whose title alone changes how you should think about today, and I mean that literally, the title is the finding. And then we're going to answer the question that I know is already sitting in your head, which is whether any of this has anything to do with the run of powerful earthquakes that has been hammering South America over the last 2 weeks. The answer to that last one is going to surprise you in both directions. But before any of that, we need to talk about what actually happened to the rock this morning, because there is something buried in the technical solution for this earthquake that tells you with almost no ambiguity what kind of fault it was standing on. And once you see it, this whole event stops being a dot on a map. Part 2. The shape of the break. When an earthquake happens, seismometers scattered across the planet record the arrival of the waves it generated, and from the pattern of those arrivals, seismologists can reconstruct not just where the rock broke, but how it broke. The result gets summarized in a diagram that looks like a beach ball, shaded in alternating quadrants, and if you have ever looked at an earthquake page and wondered what that little sphere is, You have been looking at the single most information-dense object in seismology. The beach ball tells you the orientation of the fault and the direction the two sides moved relative to each other. It comes with two numbers that matter enormously for what an earthquake does to the world above it. The first is the dip, which is how steeply the fault plane is tilted. A dip of 0 degrees is a perfectly horizontal fault. A dip of 90 degrees is a perfectly vertical one. The second is the rake, which describes the direction of slip along that plane. A rake near 0, or 180 degrees, means the two blocks slid horizontally past each other. A rake near 90 degrees means one block rode up over the other, or dropped down beneath it. For this morning's earthquake, the reviewed moment tensor solution gives two possible fault planes with dips of approximately 87 degrees and 84 degrees. 87 degrees is 3 degrees off vertical. That is a fault standing almost perfectly upright in the crust, like a pane of glass driven edge first into the ground, and the rake values that came with it were extremely close to pure horizontal motion. Put those two together and you have about as clean a signature as this kind of analysis produces. The crust here did not get shoved upward. It did not drop. It slid, sideways, one block scraping past the other along a near vertical plane, and then it stopped. That single fact is why there was never any tsunami risk from this event, and it is worth understanding the mechanism rather than just accepting the reassurance. A tsunami is not caused by shaking. It is caused by displacement of the water column, and specifically by vertical displacement of the seafloor. When a section of ocean floor suddenly lifts or drops, the entire column of water above it, which may be 4 or 5 kilometres deep, has to go somewhere. That is what generates a tsunami. It is fundamentally a plumbing problem, not a violence problem. When the seafloor slides sideways instead, the water above it barely notices. The column does not get lifted. It does not get dropped. It gets nudged laterally, and water, being water, simply flows around the disturbance and settles. This is why the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center was able to publish a statement 7 minutes after the event, rather than waiting hours for tide gauges to report. 7 minutes is not enough time to observe a tsunami. It is enough time to look at a focal mechanism and know that one is not coming. Now, that near-vertical geometry has a second implication, and this one is about where the earthquake was rather than what it did. There are, broadly speaking, 3 ways for the Earth's crust to fail. 2 blocks can be pushed together, and one rides up over the other, which is a thrust fault, and that is what produces subduction zone megaquakes and the tsunamis that come with them. 2 blocks can be pulled apart, and one drops down relative to the other, which is a normal fault, and that is what you find in rifts and spreading centres. Or 2 blocks can slide past each other horizontally, which is a strike-slip fault, and that is what happened here. Strike-slip faults are the signature of transform boundaries, the places where 2 plates are neither colliding nor separating but grinding past one another. The San Andreas is the famous one. The North Anatolian Fault in Turkey is another, and directly beneath the coordinates of this morning's earthquake is one of the stranger examples on the planet. Before we get to it, there is one more piece of the technical solution I want to hand you, because it is a genuine limitation of the method and almost nobody explains it. A focal mechanism does not tell you which fault moved. It tells you which 2 faults could have moved. Every beach ball carries 2 nodal planes, and they are mathematically indistinguishable from the seismic waves alone. The waves you record from a left lateral slip on an east-west fault are identical to the waves you would record from a right lateral slip on a north-south fault. The instrument cannot break the tie. It gives you 2 answers and shrugs. This is not a flaw in the equipment. It is a symmetry in the physics, and it means that resolving an earthquake's actual fault plane requires information from outside the seismogram. When the 2013 earthquake happened at these same coordinates, that is exactly the problem that had to be solved, and I love how it was solved, because the answer did not come from a better instrument, it came from a map. The Geological Survey's analysis noted that the mechanism permitted either left lateral motion on an east-west oriented plane or right lateral motion on a north-south oriented plane, and then resolved it by pointing at the historic seismicity, which for decades has traced a clear east-west line across this part of the ocean floor. Earthquakes had been drawing the fault for us, event by event, for half a century. The line runs east to west, therefore the east-west plane is the real one, therefore the motion was left lateral. Published wave inversions later confirmed left lateral displacement on planes striking between 97 and 102 degrees, which is very nearly due east. The seismometer offered two possibilities, and the geology chose between them. I find that genuinely satisfying, and it is a good thing to keep in mind whenever you see a confident-looking diagram on an earthquake page. That confidence was assembled from more than one source. Which brings me to the depth, and to a piece of earthquake literacy that will change how you read every one of these events from now on. Both agencies reported this earthquake at 10 kilometres. 10 kilometres exactly, not 9.4, not 11.2, 10. That roundness is a tell. 10 kilometres is the Geological Survey's default fixed depth. When an earthquake occurs far from any seismic station, which describes almost everything that happens in the Southern Ocean, the available data constrain the location well, but the depth poorly. Rather than publish a wildly uncertain number, the automatic system pins the depth at 10 kilometres and moves on. It is a placeholder. It reliably means shallow. It does not reliably mean 10. For this event, the reviewed moment tensor came back with a centroid depth of approximately 11.5 kilometres, a little over 7 miles. Still shallow. Still firmly in the upper crust, which is where transform faults do their work. But the number moved, and it moved because a human being and a more careful method looked at it after the automatic system had already published. I bring this up because magnitudes and depths change all the time in the first hours after an earthquake, and every single time they change, a certain corner of the internet reads the revision as evidence that something is being concealed. It is the opposite. A number that gets refined is a number being computed properly. The alarming thing would be a number that never moved, because that would mean nobody looked at it twice. And in this particular case, there is a revision I need to tell you about that is genuinely unresolved as I record this, and it changes the entire meaning of today's event. But before we get there, you need to understand what is underneath these coordinates, because the fault we are talking about is not an ordinary one, and the reason this story matters at all is that this specific piece of crust is one of the strangest tectonic structures on the face of the Earth. Part 3. The fault under all of this. Pull back from the epicentre until you can see the whole South Atlantic, and you will notice something odd in the gap between the tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula. Most of the planet's surface is covered by a small number of very large plates. There are 7 or 8 major ones, depending on how you count, and they are enormous, spanning entire oceans and continents. But in a handful of places, the geometry of those major plates does not close cleanly, and the crust in between gets broken into smaller fragments that behave like plates in their own right. These are the microplates, and the Scotia plate is one of the most spectacular examples anywhere. It sits in the Drake Passage region, wedged between the South American plate to the north and the Antarctic plate to the south, with the smaller Sandwich plate hanging off its eastern edge. It is being squeezed between two of the largest tectonic objects on the planet, and its northern and southern edges are both dominantly transform boundaries. Which is to say, this plate is not being crushed, and it is not being pulled apart so much as it is being sheared, gripped along its top and bottom edges by two giants sliding in opposite directions. The southern edge is the one we care about. It is called the South Scotia Ridge, and it is the boundary between the Scotia plate and the Antarctic plate. The published characterization of this boundary is that it is predominantly left lateral strike slip, which matches exactly what this morning's beach ball showed us. Left lateral means that if you stood on one side and looked across the fault, the far block would appear to move to your left. In the literature it is often described more precisely as sinistral transtensional, which is a compact way of saying that the dominant motion is left lateral shearing, but there is a component of extension mixed in, so parts of the boundary are being pulled slightly apart as they slide. Hold on to that word, transtensional. It becomes important later, and it is going to complicate a reassurance that I gave you 20 minutes ago. It is worth pausing on how this arrangement came to exist, because the Scotia plate is not an ancient feature that has always been here. It is young, geologically speaking, and it was manufactured by one of the most consequential events in the planet's climate history. For most of the age of the dinosaurs and well beyond it, South America and Antarctica were joined. They were the last two pieces of the old southern supercontinent still holding hands, connected through what is now the Antarctic Peninsula. As long as that connection existed, the ocean could not circulate freely around Antarctica. Warm water from the north could reach the continent, and Antarctica, despite sitting on the pole, was forested. Then the connection tore. The two landmasses pulled apart, the gap between them widened into what we now call the Drake Passage, and seafloor spreading filled the growing space with new crust. The fragments of continental material that had been caught in the middle of that separation were dragged east, stretched, rotated and stranded, and they are still out there. The South Orkney microcontinent, the block of crust sitting right at the centre of everything we are discussing today, is one of those stranded fragments. It is a piece of the old bridge between two continents, left behind in open ocean when the bridge broke. And once that gap was open, the ocean did what oceans do. Water began circulating continuously around Antarctica, unobstructed by any landmass, in what became the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the largest current on the planet. That current effectively sealed Antarctica off from the warmth of the rest of the world's oceans, and the continent froze. The forests died, the ice sheets grew. So the tectonic system we are looking at this morning is, in a real sense, the machinery that made Antarctica what it is. The fault that produced this earthquake exists because two continents let go of each other, and the letting go changed the climate of the entire planet. That is the neighbourhood we are standing in. Now, how fast is it moving? The peer-reviewed estimates put the slip rate at roughly 7.4 to 9.5 millimetres per year. The figure the Geological Survey quoted in its materials around the 2013 event was approximately 11 millimetres per year. Somewhere in that band is the truth. Either way, this is a slow boundary, ludicrously slow, by the standards of the faults that make the news. The San Andreas system moves at something like 30 to 40 millimetres per year, and at the far eastern end of this very same plate system, at the South Sandwich Trench, the convergence rate is 70 to 78 millimetres per year, which is close to 10 times faster than the fault we are standing on right now. Same plate system, two edges, a factor of 10 between them. 7 to 11 millimetres per year is roughly the rate at which a fingernail grows. It is the width of a pencil, every year, for a very long time. And that slowness pulls in two directions at once, which is exactly why this fault is interesting rather than boring. On one hand, slow boundaries take a long time to reload. If a segment of fault releases 4 or 5 metres of accumulated slip in a single earthquake, and the plates are only feeding it 9 millimetres a year, you are looking at 4 or 5 centuries to build that back. Large earthquakes on slow faults are rare, and that rarity is real. On the other hand, slow does not mean weak, and it does not mean small, it means patient. The plates never stop pushing, not for a day, not for a decade. The stress accumulates continuously, and sections of the fault lock up, holding on against that steady load until they cannot hold any longer. What comes out at the end of that process is not proportional to the rate of loading. It is proportional to how much was stored, and in 2013 this fault demonstrated exactly how much it is capable of storing. There is one more feature of this boundary that matters enormously for what we are about to discuss, and it is the least glamorous fact in this entire video. The South Scotia Ridge is a mess. I do not mean that as a criticism, I mean it structurally. This is not a single, clean, continuous fracture running neatly across the ocean floor like a line drawn with a ruler. Published work describes a boundary littered with complications, fragments of old continental crust that got stranded here when the region tore apart, deep sedimentary basins, bends and kinks in the boundary trace, zones where the crust is being locally pulled apart, and other zones where the geometry forces it to be locally squeezed. The South Orkney microcontinent itself, which sits right in the middle of all of this, is a chunk of continental material that used to be attached to something else entirely. Fault geometry controls earthquake behaviour. A long, straight, simple fault tends to produce ruptures that start at one end and run cleanly to the other. A fault with bends, step-overs and inherited weaknesses does something much less predictable. Ruptures on complex faults can stall at a bend, jump across a gap, restart on a neighbouring strand, or die out entirely halfway through what looked like a promising start. Which means that when a moderate earthquake happens on a boundary like this one, you genuinely cannot tell from the earthquake itself whether you're watching a self-contained event on an isolated strand, or the first move in something that is going to work its way along the structure. Complicated fault systems produce complicated sequences. That is not hand-waving. That is the observed behaviour of geometrically complex boundaries worldwide. Now follow the boundary in each direction, because this is where the geography starts doing something for you. Head west from this morning's epicentre along the South Scotia Ridge, and you are travelling toward the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, toward the South Shetland Islands, and eventually toward the region where this whole tectonic system connects to Tierra del Fuego at the southern end of South America. Head east and you run into the South Sandwich Islands and the South Sandwich Trench, one of the most seismically busy subduction systems on Earth, and a place we're going to spend serious time in later because it produced something in 2021 that most people have never heard of and absolutely should have. So this fault is not out in the middle of nowhere in any meaningful sense. It is the structural bridge between two continents. It is the connective tissue between the tectonics of southern South America and the tectonics of Antarctica, and it happens to run through one of the emptiest and least instrumented stretches of ocean on the planet. Which brings me to what I think is the genuinely unsettling part of this story, and it has nothing to do with magnitudes or fault planes, or how big the next one could be. It has to do with how little we can actually see. Part 4. The Plate. Nobody is standing on. I want to read you something that appears in the official material describing this plate boundary, and I want you to listen to it as a sentence about knowledge rather than a sentence about geology. According to the Geological Survey, there are no land-based observations within the Scotia Plate to measure plate motion. All reported plate motions are derived from remote earthquake recordings. Sit with that for a second. Everything I have just told you about how fast this plate is moving, every published slip rate, the 7.4 millimeters, and the 9.5 millimeters and the 11 millimeters, none of it comes from an instrument sitting on the Scotia Plate watching it move. It comes from listening to the plate break from thousands of kilometers away and reasoning backwards. To appreciate how unusual that is, consider how the rest of the world is monitored. In California, in Japan, in Turkey, in Italy, in New Zealand, dense networks of permanent satellite positioning stations are bolted to bedrock across every major fault system. They report continuously. They measure ground motion at the level of a few millimeters a year, which means they can watch strain accumulating in real time. When a fault segment locks up and starts loading, the network sees the surrounding crust deforming around it. When a segment creeps quietly without producing earthquakes, the network sees that too. Modern hazard assessment on well-instrumented faults is built almost entirely on that continuous geodetic backbone. The Scotia Plate has none of it. The reason is simple and slightly absurd. To bolt an instrument to a plate, you need somewhere to bolt it, and the Scotia Plate is almost entirely underwater. The few pieces of land that break the surface are small, remote, brutally cold, and expensive to reach. There is no dense network out here because there is nowhere to put one, and no easy way to service it if you did. So the situation for this fault is genuinely different from the faults you're used to hearing about. We do not have a strain gauge on it. We do not know which segments are locked and which are creeping. We do not know how much slip deficit has accumulated on the patch that broke this morning, or on the patch next to it, or on the patch next to that. We have a boundary trace inferred largely from where earthquakes have happened, a slip rate inferred from plate motion models, and a catalogue of events going back a few decades. Which means that the only signal this plate boundary is capable of sending us is an earthquake. That is the core of this entire story, and it is why I think this event deserves 2 hours instead of a headline. Every single thing we know about the state of this fault we learned by watching it fail. There is no early warning here, not because anyone is negligent, but because the instrument that would provide it does not exist, and would be extraordinarily difficult to build. The fault's only vocabulary is rupture. When it wants to tell us something, it has exactly one word. So this morning it said that word 67 kilometers west of the place, where it last said it very loudly indeed, and we are standing here trying to work out from a single syllable whether we are at the beginning of a sentence or the end of one. I want to push on this because the implications go further than they first appear. Think about what it means that our record of this boundary is a record of failures. Every point on the map where we believe the fault runs is a point where an earthquake has occurred. Segments that have been quiet for the entire instrumental era, whether because they are creeping harmlessly or because they are locked and loading towards something enormous, look identical in that record. They look like blank space, and a blank space on a map of earthquakes is one of the most dangerous objects in hazard science, because there are two completely opposite explanations for it, and no way to tell them apart from the map alone. It might be a stretch of fault that does not store stress, or it might be a seismic gap, a locked patch that has been silently accumulating strain for centuries, while its neighbours release theirs in a steady rhythm of moderate events. On a well-instrumented fault, you resolve that ambiguity with geodesy. You watch the ground. If the crust around a quiet segment is deforming, that segment is locked and loading. If it is not, the segment is creeping. It is not a perfect method, but it is a method. Out here there is no such option. The blank spaces stay ambiguous, and there is a second consequence that I find even more uncomfortable, which is that our entire sense of how often this fault produces large earthquakes rests on a record barely 50 or 60 years long. Global seismic monitoring of the standard we would recognise today really begins in the 1960s. Before that, an earthquake in the Southern Ocean would have been detected only if it were very large and located only very roughly. 50 or 60 years on a fault that moves at 9 millimetres per year is not a long time. If the recurrence interval for the largest events on a given segment of this boundary is 200 years or 400, then our entire observational window covers a fraction of a single cycle. We are trying to characterise the rhythm of a drum by listening to it for a few beats. In that window, we have seen 2 events in the 7.6 to 7.8 range in 2003 and in 2013. We do not know whether that pace is typical, unusually busy, or unusually quiet, because we have not been listening long enough to know what typical sounds like. Let me put an actual number on that, because the arithmetic is sobering, and it takes 10 seconds. Take the middle of the published slip rate range, call it 9 millimetres per year. A large strike-slip earthquake on a boundary like this one might release somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 metres of accumulated offset along the section that ruptures. To store 3 metres at 9 millimetres a year takes about 330 years. To store 5 metres takes over 500. Our instrumental record is between 50 and 60 years long. So even in the most generous reading, we've been watching this fault for something like 10 to 15% of a single loading cycle for its largest events. Imagine being handed a 6-second clip of a 2-hour film and being asked to describe the plot. That is roughly the position we are in, and it is why nobody with any professional caution will give you a recurrence interval for this boundary with a straight face. It also cuts against a reassurance that is easy to reach for. When 2 large earthquakes happen 10 years apart, as they did here in 2003 and 2013, the instinctive read is that this fault produces big events every decade or so, and we are therefore some years away from the next. But 10 years is not a recurrence interval. 10 years is a coincidence inside a window too short to contain a recurrence interval. The 2 events were not the same segment going twice. They were, as we are about to see, 2 different segments going once each. This is not a criticism of the science. The people who work on this boundary know all of this far better than I do, and say so plainly in their papers, in careful language, with the uncertainties stated. It is a description of a genuine limit, and I think the limit itself is the most interesting thing about this story. Because when you strip everything else away, what happened this morning is this: a plate we cannot watch, moving at a speed we have inferred rather than measured, on a boundary whose quiet stretches we cannot interpret, produced the only kind of signal it is able to produce at a location that has an extraordinarily specific history. And the honest position, the one I actually hold, is that nobody can tell you what it means. Not me, not a seismologist, not anyone. What we can do is know exactly what to look for over the coming days, and that is a real and useful thing, and we will get there. But first we have to go back to November of 2013 properly, because I have given you the outline of those 4 days, and the outline does not do it justice. There is a detail in the official record from that week that I had to read twice, and then a third time, because I could not believe that a National Research Institute had said it out loud and that nobody had built a story around it. They said it in 2013. It has been sitting there ever since. Part 5. 4 days in November. Wednesday, the 13th of November, 2013. Nothing about that day looked like the beginning of anything. A magnitude 6.1 occurred in the Scotia Sea, roughly 50 kilometres west of a set of coordinates that meant nothing to anyone yet. It was the kind of event that generates an automatic bulletin and no news coverage. Moderate, offshore, nobody nearby. If you had gone looking for it in the world's newspapers the next morning, you would not have found it. Friday, the 15th of November. 2 days later, a magnitude 6.8 struck very close to that first event. Now the pattern was becoming visible to anyone watching the feeds, but visible and alarming are different things. 2 moderate earthquakes in the same offshore area within 48 hours is unremarkable. Faults do this constantly. In the vast majority of cases, the sequence peaks and decays, and that is the end of it. Sunday, the 17th of November, at 4 minutes and 55 seconds past 9 in the morning, Universal Time. Magnitude 7.8. 4 days. That is the entire interval from the first moderate event to the largest earthquake ever recorded in this region. Not 4 months of gradually escalating warning. 4 days across a single weekend on a boundary that most people had never heard of. And the response of the fault to that main shock was immediate and it was legible. Within 8 hours of the rupture, 20 aftershocks between magnitude 4.6 and magnitude 5.3 occurred near the epicentre. What matters is not the count but the arrangement. They were all aligned along the southern boundary of the Scotia Plate. The aftershocks drew the fault. If you plotted them, you were looking at a line, and the line was the structure that had just failed. That is what a rupture looks like in the days after it happens. The main shock breaks a section of fault, and the edges of that broken section, where the stress got concentrated rather than relieved, start letting go in a scatter of smaller events that trace out the boundaries of the thing that moved. Aftershocks are the fault showing you its own dimensions. The British Antarctic Survey, which had a direct interest because it operates a research station in the immediate area, counted more than 40 earthquakes exceeding magnitude 4.4 in the region from that Wednesday onward. And they noted correctly that there had almost certainly been many more below that threshold, because the global monitoring network cannot detect small events in a place this remote. Out here, an earthquake has to be reasonably substantial before anyone anywhere hears it. The affected section of the Scotia-Antarctica plate boundary, according to their assessment, was approximately 300 kilometres long. 300 kilometres. That is not a point on a map. That is a stretch of fault roughly the distance from London to Manchester and halfway back, all of it in motion across a single week, in an ocean where nobody was standing. For scale on how remote that is, the affected zone sat about 1,200 kilometres southeast of Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. Port Stanley is not exactly a metropolis. The nearest thing to a city in the direction of this earthquake was 750 miles further away than the most isolated town most people can name. Now, the magnitude of the 2013 main shock is not a single agreed number, and this is worth 30 seconds because it tells you something about how these figures work. In the Geological Survey's catalogue, the event is a magnitude 7.7. In the Global Centroid Moment Tensor catalogue, and in most of the published scientific literature that followed, it is a magnitude 7.8. Both are correct. They are the output of different methods applied to the same seismic waves, weighting different parts of the signal, and they disagree by 1/10 of a unit. 1/10 of a unit does not sound like much until you convert it to energy, at which point it is a factor of about 1.4. 40% more energy, or 40% less, depending on which catalogue you happen to be reading. And this is our benchmark. This is the number we use when we say, this fault has demonstrated it can produce something approaching magnitude 8. Even the benchmark carries a real uncertainty band, and I would rather tell you that than pretend precision that does not exist. Whichever figure you use, the significance is the same. It was the largest earthquake ever recorded in the Scotia Sea region across the entire instrumental era. It was the 3rd largest earthquake anywhere in the world that year, and it happened on a plate boundary that hardly anyone outside the specialist literature had ever thought about. There is one more thing about the 2013 sequence that I keep returning to, and it is the reason we are here at all. The sequence had a geometry. It did not begin at the main shock epicentre and spread outward. It began 50 kilometres to the west, with a magnitude 6.1, and worked its way to the main event over 4 days. This morning, a magnitude 6.2 occurred 67 kilometres to the west of that same main shock epicentre. I have said that twice now, and I am going to say it exactly once more before this video ends because repetition is how a genuine observation turns into an unearned prediction, and I have no interest in doing that. So let me be precise about what the parallel is and is not. It is not evidence that the same thing is happening. The sample size is 1. A single historical sequence does not establish a pattern, and if you went looking through the global earthquake catalogue for moderate events that occurred a few dozen kilometres from a previous large earthquake, you would find thousands of them, and almost none of them were followed by anything. And it is worth noting that 4 days is not the only shape this can take. because we covered a much more extreme version of it on this channel not long ago. 5 days ago, when we were looking at the pattern of activity across the planet, we went through what happened at Kamchatka. That magnitude 8.8, the largest earthquake anywhere on Earth since Tohoku in 2011, and one of the 10 largest since 1900, was preceded by a foreshock sequence that ran for 10 days. Around 50 events of magnitude 5 or greater. Inside that run were 3 separate magnitude 6.6 events, and, most strikingly, a magnitude 7.4 that arrived 9 days before the main shock. Think about what that means for anyone trying to read a sequence in real time. A magnitude 7.4 is not a small earthquake. It is a serious event in its own right, the kind that leads news bulletins and damages buildings, and it turned out to be the warm-up act. Anyone standing in Kamchatka on the 20th of July, looking at a magnitude 7.4 would have had no way of knowing that they were looking at a foreshock rather than the main event, because a magnitude 7.4 looks exactly like a magnitude 7.4 either way. That is the uncomfortable centre of this entire subject. The foreshocks that precede the largest earthquakes on the planet are not special. They do not sound different, look different, or register differently. They are ordinary earthquakes that happen to be followed by something bigger, and the only thing that distinguishes them is the thing that has not happened yet. So when I say that today's magnitude 6.2 is worth watching, I'm not saying it carries a signature that betrays what is coming. I am saying the opposite. It cannot carry such a signature because no earthquake does. What it carries is a location, and the location is what we are reading. What it is a reason to look. It tells you that this specific segment has a demonstrated failure mode in which moderate events on its western side precede a much larger rupture within days. That failure mode has occurred here once. Once is not a pattern, but once is considerably more than never, and it means that the next several days of seismicity on this boundary carry information that a random week does not. And the reason I keep circling back to the fact that nobody has an instrument out there is that the aftershock sequence is not merely one source of information about what happens next. On this fault, it is the only one. We cannot look at the strain. We can only wait and see what the fault does, and read it after the fact. But there is something else in the record from that week in 2013, not a number, a sentence. And I think it is the most important thing anyone has ever written about this plate boundary. Part 6. The sentence that should have been a headline. The British Antarctic Survey operates a research station called Sini on Sini Island in the South Orkneys at 60 degrees 43 minutes south, 45 degrees 36 minutes west, in a place called Factory Cove on Borge Bay. When it's fully staffed, it houses up to 8 people. It is a summer station. Through the austral winter it sits empty and locked, and the people who work there return with the ice retreat. In November of 2013, the summer team had not yet arrived. The research vessel carrying them, the RRS James Clark Ross, was due to reach the island the following week. So when the plate boundary a short distance to the north produced more than 40 earthquakes in 5 days, culminating in the largest event ever recorded in the region, there was nobody at Sini to experience it. The buildings took it alone. The survey's marine geophysicist Dr. Rob Larter put it about as dryly as it can be put. Speaking about the state of the station, he said, "I understand that no one has got there yet this season, but when people do get ashore, it is likely that they will find things have been shaken up a bit." I have a lot of affection for that quote. There is something wonderfully British about describing the aftermath of the largest earthquake in the recorded history of an ocean as things being shaken up a bit. But it also tells you the practical reality of this place. The nearest human infrastructure to a magnitude 7.8 earthquake was a small collection of buildings that nobody could get to, and the plan for assessing the damage was to sail there eventually and have a look. That is the same situation today. It is currently the austral winter. Sini is almost certainly empty right now, but Sini is not the only station out there, and the other one has been sitting beside this fault for a very long time, which we will come to. What I actually want to give you from that week is not the quote about the buildings. It is the sentence the survey wrote when explaining the tectonics to the public, because it contains the single most consequential statement about this boundary that I have found anywhere, and it has been sitting in a public communication since 2013 with, as far as I can tell, almost nobody building anything around it. Here it is, verbatim. The large events this week have all been strike slip, horizontal displacement, movements related to Scotia Antarctic plate motion, which do not pose a significant tsunami risk. However, such sideways moving events can destabilise adjacent segments of a fault in a sort of domino effect. Read the second half of that again. Such sideways moving events can destabilise adjacent segments of a fault in a sort of domino effect. That is not a comment thread. That is not somebody's channel. That is a National Polar Research Institute in an official public communication stating that strike-slip earthquakes on this specific plate boundary can destabilise the fault segments next to them. Now I want to be scrupulously careful about what that sentence licenses, because domino effect is exactly the kind of phrase that gets amputated from its context and glued onto a thumbnail. The survey was not predicting a cascade. They were explaining a mechanism, and the mechanism is real, mainstream and boring in the best sense. When a section of fault slips, it does not simply consume the stress it was carrying, it redistributes it. Some neighbouring patches end up relaxed by that redistribution, others end up pushed slightly closer to failure. The technical name for this is static stress transfer, and the standard measure of it is the change in Coulomb failure stress, which for a neighbouring segment typically comes out in fractions of a bar. That is a genuinely tiny push. Atmospheric pressure at sea level is about 1 bar. We are talking about a nudge equivalent to a small fraction of the weight of the air. But a fraction of a bar is enough if the fault was already within a fraction of a bar of breaking. And the whole point of a locked fault segment is that at some moment it will be. Stress transfer does not create earthquakes out of nothing. It changes the timing of earthquakes that were coming anyway, sometimes by years, sometimes by minutes. That is the mechanism the survey was pointing at, and it is why the events of a single week in November 2013 were spread across 300 kilometres of boundary rather than confined to one spot. The classic demonstration of this happened in California in 1992, and it is the case that persuaded the field. On the 28th of June that year, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck near Landers in the Mojave Desert. 3 hours and 26 minutes later, a magnitude 6.5 struck at Big Bear, about 40 kilometres away, on a completely different fault. At the time, that looked like an eerie coincidence. It was not. When researchers calculated how the Landers rupture had redistributed stress into the surrounding crust, the Big Bear fault sat squarely inside a lobe where the stress change was positive. Landers had pushed it closer to failure by a small amount, and it had failed within a few hours. The calculation and the observation matched, and the threshold that emerged from that work and the work that followed, around 1/10 of a bar of stress change, is still the rough rule of thumb the field uses for when a nearby fault has been meaningfully loaded. What makes that case so instructive is the asymmetry it revealed. Not everything near Landers was pushed toward failure. The stress change calculation produces a pattern of lobes, some positive and some negative, arranged around the rupture according to its geometry. Some faults in the neighbourhood were relaxed by that earthquake, made less likely to break, not more. It is not a blast radius. It is a redistribution, and whether any given neighbour is helped or hindered depends on how it is oriented relative to the fault that just moved. So when the survey talks about a domino effect on this boundary, the physics behind the phrase is not that one earthquake shoves the next one over. It is that one earthquake rewrites the stress budget of everything around it, and some of the neighbours end up worse off than they were the day before. So what does that sentence mean for this morning? It means the reassurance I gave you earlier has an edge on it. I told you that this earthquake could not produce a tsunami because the motion was horizontal, and that is true, and it remains true. But the survey's statement makes clear that the absence of a tsunami risk is not the same as the absence of a consequence. A strike-slip event on this boundary does not threaten a coastline. It does something else. It changes the loading on the rock next to it, and that is what connects that quote directly to this morning's event. The whole question of whether a magnitude 6.267 kilometres west of a former magnitude 7.8 matters is a question about whether events on this boundary influence their neighbours. The institute that studies this coastline answered that question in public more than a decade ago, and the answer was yes. Which raises the obvious follow-up, and it is the one that turns this from an interesting historical parallel into something with teeth. If big earthquakes here influence their neighbours, then which neighbour is next in line? Is it the patch that already broke in 2013, reloading, or is it a different patch entirely, one that has been quietly waiting? There is a paper that answers that, and the answer is in the title. Part 7. Complementary. In 2014, a group of researchers including Lingling Ye, Thorn Lei and Hiru Kanamori published a study in the journal Earth and Planetary Science Letters, volume 401, pages 215 to 226. The title of that paper is Complementary Slip Distributions of the August 4, 2003, magnitude 7.6 and November 17, 2013, magnitude 7.8 South Scotia Ridge earthquakes. I want to isolate one word out of that because the entire finding is contained in it, and it changes the shape of today's question: complementary. In this context, complementary slip distributions means that the two great earthquakes on this boundary did not break the same ground. They broke adjacent ground. The 2003 earthquake released strain on one patch of the fault. 11 years later, the 2013 earthquake released strain on a patch beside it, largely non-overlapping with the first. Together they fill in a stretch of boundary the way two adjacent tiles fill a floor edge to edge, rather than one landing on top of the other. That is a different picture of how this fault behaves than most people carry around in their heads, and it dismantles a piece of comfort that almost everyone reaches for instinctively. The instinctive model of earthquakes is a pressure valve. Stress builds, the fault ruptures, the stress is released, and the location goes quiet for a long time while it slowly refills. Under that model, a place that has recently had a very large earthquake is one of the safer places to be, because the stress has been spent. People say this out loud all the time. It already went. It is not due. The complementary slip picture says something else about this boundary. It says the fault does not release its stress at a point. It releases it segment by segment, and each rupture hands the problem to the segment next door. 2003 went. 2013 went beside it. The pressure valve model would tell you that this stretch of boundary is now spent. The complementary model tells you to ask a much more uncomfortable question. Which patch has not gone yet? Because if large ruptures here fill in adjacent unbroken ground rather than repeating on the same ground, then the interesting real estate is not where the 2013 earthquake happened. The interesting real estate is immediately beside it, on whichever side has not been released. And today's earthquake is 67 kilometres west of the 2013 epicentre, on the side the 2013 sequence itself opened from. I said I would say that once more, and that was it. I am not going to say it again because the point is made, and hammering it would turn an observation into a claim I cannot support. Before we go further, the 2003 earthquake deserves a proper introduction, because there is a genuine scientific disagreement attached to it that most coverage will not touch, and it undoes a reassurance I gave you earlier. On the 4th of August 2003, a magnitude 7.6 struck at about 10 kilometres depth on the northern margin of the South Orkney microcontinent. Until 2013 came along, it was the largest earthquake ever recorded in the Scotia Sea. Here is the disagreement. The British Antarctic Survey, in that same 2013 communication, described the 2003 event as a normal faulting movement. Normal faulting means vertical displacement, one block dropping relative to the other, and the survey said so specifically in order to make a contrast, noting that vertical displacement is the kind of motion that can pose a risk of a tsunami, unlike the strike-slip events of 2013. Meanwhile, the slip distribution literature, including that 2014 paper, treats 2003 and 2013 as two events on the same transform system, complementary pieces of one boundary. Both of those can be true at once, and the word that reconciles them is the one I asked you to hold on to earlier: transtensional. This boundary is not purely strike-slip, it is dominantly strike-slip with extension mixed in, which means the crust here is being sheared sideways while also being pulled slightly apart. On a margin like that, most earthquakes will be strike-slip, but in places where the local geometry favours extension, a segment can fail in normal faulting instead. Different segments, different mechanisms, same boundary. And that matters more than it might appear, because earlier in this video I told you that this earthquake could not produce a tsunami, and I gave you the reason, and the reason was sound. But I want to correct the implication rather than the fact. The correct statement is that this earthquake could not produce a tsunami. The incorrect statement, which is easy to slide into, is that this boundary cannot produce a tsunami. It can. It appears to have done so in the mechanism sense in 2003, which is exactly why the survey drew the contrast. If a future rupture on this margin lands on one of the extensional segments and fails vertically rather than horizontally, The physics changes and the water above it does have somewhere to go. That is not a prediction, and it is not likely on any given day. It is simply the honest boundary of the reassurance, and I would rather hand you the reassurance with its edges marked than hand you a comfortable version of it that does not survive contact with the record. There is more in the rupture analysis that is worth having, because it tells you something about the character of the fault rather than just the arithmetic of where it broke. Published work on the 2013 event describes the rupture as having proceeded in 5 distinct sub-events, with average rupture velocities of approximately 0.6, 2.6, 2.3, 2.8 and 3 kilometres per second. Look at that first number against the ones that follow it. The rupture began slowly. 0.6 kilometres per second is sluggish for a crack propagating through rock. Then it accelerated hard, running at 2 to 3 kilometres per second through the remaining stages, which is a fairly typical speed for a large strike-slip rupture. It did not travel at one steady velocity from one end of the fault to the other. It stuttered, caught, accelerated, and moved through the structure in stages. That is the fingerprint of a geometrically complex fault, which is exactly what we established this boundary is. A rupture running along a clean, straight fault plane tends to propagate at a fairly constant velocity. A rupture running through a boundary littered with bends, stranded continental fragments and inherited weaknesses does what this one did. It hits an obstacle, slows, builds up enough stress to break through, and accelerates again into the next section. Which brings us to the most consequential implication of the whole complementary slip picture, and it is a question about how a rupture decides when to stop. When the 2013 earthquake ran out of energy and stopped, it stopped somewhere. There is a physical edge to that rupture, a place where the moving crack could not continue, and at that edge the fault is not relieved, it is loaded. The rock immediately beyond the end of a rupture is where stress concentrates most sharply, which is precisely why aftershocks cluster around rupture terminations. So the 2013 event ended, and its western edge became a stress concentration, and today, 13 years later, a magnitude 6.2 occurred in the general direction of that western edge. Is that the same thing as the fault preparing to extend the 2013 rupture westward into unbroken ground? I do not know. Nobody does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. 13 years is a long time for a stress concentration to sit there without anything happening, and the fact that this earthquake occurred west rather than east could be pure chance in a boundary that produces moderate earthquakes routinely. But this is where the absence of instrumentation stops being an abstract complaint and becomes a concrete problem. If there were a geodetic network on this plate, we could look at whether the crust west of the 2013 rupture has been deforming for the last 13 years. We could see whether that segment is locked and loading or creeping harmlessly. We could answer the question directly instead of arguing about it. There is no network, so the question stays open, and the only thing that will ever close it is the fault doing something else. Which leads to the question I have been building toward this entire time, and it is the one that people are actually asking about this morning's earthquake. Was that a foreshock? The honest answer to that is stranger and more interesting than either yes or no, and it starts with the fact that the word itself is a trap. Part 8. Foreshock is a word you can only use backwards. Here is the thing about the word foreshock that almost nobody says plainly, and once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it. A foreshock is not a type of earthquake. It is a label applied retrospectively to an ordinary earthquake, on the basis of something that happened afterwards. There is no physical property that distinguishes a foreshock from any other event. It does not have a different waveform. It does not have a distinctive frequency content, or an unusual duration, or a telltale mechanism. If you handed a seismologist the complete recording of a magnitude 6.2 and asked them whether it was a foreshock, the only honest answer available would be, ask me again in 2 weeks. The label is created by the future. An earthquake becomes a foreshock at the moment a larger earthquake occurs nearby, and not 1 second before. Until then, it is simply an earthquake, indistinguishable in every measurable respect from the 100-odd other magnitude 6 events that will occur around the world this year and be followed by nothing. I find this genuinely humbling, and I think it is the single most important thing to understand about what we are looking at this morning. Everything I have told you about the location, about the 67 kilometres, about November 2013, is inference from context. None of it is a signal read out of the earthquake itself, because the earthquake itself does not contain one. So what do the numbers actually say about how often this happens? The published work on foreshock probability, going back to studies from the 1980s and refined many times since, puts the global rate at a few percent, meaning take any earthquake of moderate size anywhere on Earth, and the probability that it will be followed within a few days by a larger earthquake nearby is small, in the low single digits. Different studies produce different numbers depending on the region, the catalogue, the magnitude threshold and the time window, which is why I am going to say a few percent. Rather than give you a false precision figure that would fall apart the moment anyone checked it. A few percent is not nothing. A few percent is roughly the probability of drawing a specific card out of a deck. If someone told you there was a 1 in 25 chance that the largest earthquake in the recorded history of an ocean basin was going to happen this week, you would not shrug at that. But a few percent is also, overwhelmingly, a statement that the answer is no. 90-something times out of 100, a moderate earthquake is exactly what it appears to be. Now, base rates are not fixed, they are conditional. The question is never, what is the probability that an earthquake is a foreshock, in the abstract. It is, what is the probability given everything else I know about where it happened? And there are 3 conditions attached to this particular event that would move any careful person's estimate upward from the base rate, without moving it anywhere near likely. The first condition is demonstrated capability. This is not a fault where a magnitude 7+ event would be unprecedented and would require some new physics to explain. This segment has produced a magnitude 7.6 and a magnitude 7.8 within the last 23 years, both recorded, both published, both in the catalogue. The upper bound is not a model output, it is an observation. The second condition is the demonstrated failure mode. The last time this segment produced a sequence, that sequence opened with a moderate event on its western side and escalated to the main shock within 4 days. That has happened here exactly once, which is not a pattern, but it is a demonstrated behaviour of this specific piece of crust, rather than a generic possibility imported from somewhere else. The third condition is the complementary slip finding, and this is the one that does the most work. If large ruptures here fill the same patch repeatedly, then the ground beside the 2013 rupture would be of no particular interest, because we would expect the next big event to occur where the last one did, after a long enough interval to reload. But the published picture is the opposite. These ruptures fill adjacent, largely non-overlapping ground. Under that model, the big one already happened here, is not a reassurance about the neighbouring segment. It is arguably the reverse. Stack those 3 together and you get something that is still, in absolute terms, unlikely. But you also get something that is a great deal more interesting than a random magnitude 6.2 in a random ocean, and that is the entire justification for spending time on it. I want to spend a moment on why we cannot do better than this, because I think people assume the uncertainty is a failure of effort rather than a property of the problem. Earthquake prediction, in the strong sense of naming a time, place and magnitude in advance, with useful precision, does not exist. It is not that nobody has tried. Enormous resources have gone into it for over a century, and the honest summary of that effort is that the field has established with considerable confidence that a great many proposed precursors do not work. Radon emissions, animal behaviour, unusual cloud formations, well water levels, electromagnetic signals. Each has generated excitement, and each has failed to survive systematic testing against a catalogue. The history of that effort is worth 2 minutes, because it explains why the field talks the way it does now. In February of 1975, Chinese authorities evacuated the city of Haicheng ahead of a magnitude 7.3 earthquake. The decision was based on an accumulation of signals, a swarm of foreshocks, changes in well water levels, reports of unusual animal behaviour and ground deformation. The earthquake arrived and the evacuation is widely credited with saving a very large number of lives. For a brief period it looked as though earthquake prediction had been solved. 18 months later, in July of 1976, a magnitude 7.6 struck Tangshan, roughly 400 kilometres away. There was no foreshock sequence. There was no warning. The death toll was catastrophic, among the worst of the 20th century. The lesson of those 2 events together is not that Haicheng was a fluke. It is that the method only works when the earthquake happens to announce itself, and most of them do not. Tangshan was not a failure of vigilance. It was a demonstration that some ruptures simply arrive, with nothing in front of them. Then there was Parkfield, a small section of the San Andreas in central California, had produced moderate earthquakes at what looked like strikingly regular intervals, roughly every 22 years, through the 19th and 20th centuries. In the mid-1980s, the Geological Survey formally predicted that the next one would occur before 1993, and the segment was instrumented more densely than almost any piece of ground on Earth in order to catch it in the act. It did not arrive in 1993. It arrived in September of 2004, more than a decade past the window, and when it came, none of the instruments recorded any clear precursor. Parkfield is often described as a failure. I think that is unfair, and it misses what actually happened. It was the most rigorous test the hypothesis had ever received. It was conducted honestly. The result was published, and the result was negative. That is science working. What it established is that even on a fault chosen specifically because it appeared to behave regularly, saturated with instruments, watched by an entire field, the timing was not predictable and the precursors were not there. After Parkfield, the ambition changed, which brings us to what replaced prediction, something less satisfying and far more useful, which is probabilistic forecasting. Nobody will tell you that a magnitude 7 is coming to the South Scotia Ridge on a particular Tuesday. What can be done, and is done routinely after significant earthquakes, is to state how the probability of a larger event in a given region has changed relative to the background rate over a defined window. That is a real product with real value, and it looks nothing like the prediction people imagine when they think about earthquake science. The reason forecasting works and prediction does not come down to what a fault actually is. It is not a machine with a schedule. It is a rough, irregular surface under enormous stress, in a rock volume whose exact strength varies from point to point in ways we cannot map from the outside. Whether a small slip event arrests after a few hundred meters or runs for 300 kilometres depends on conditions along the fault that we simply cannot measure at the relevant resolution. In many respects, it appears to be genuinely undetermined at the moment the rupture begins, which means the honest answer to "was this morning a foreshock" is not a hedge, and it is not evasion. It is a description of the physics. The rupture that would make it a foreshock has not been decided yet, and it may be decided by conditions on a patch of rock 5 kilometres below the seafloor that no instrument has ever sampled. Now, everything I have just told you about this event rests on a set of numbers, and I need to tell you that one of those numbers is currently in dispute in a way that changes the entire interpretation. Part 9. The fight over one number. There is a second earthquake in this story, and whether it exists at all is genuinely unclear as I am recording this. The account of today's activity includes a magnitude 5.7 in the Scotia Sea occurring roughly 7 hours and 42 minutes before the magnitude 6.2. Work backwards from 22 minutes past 8, and that puts it somewhere around 40 minutes past midnight, universal time, on the same day. If that is right, then what we are looking at is not a single earthquake. It is a sequence with structure, a moderate event, then a stronger event several hours later in the same general area. That is a foreshock and a main shock, and it means the fault has already demonstrated today that it is capable of producing more than one significant event in a single day. But there is a competing reading, and it is not exotic. At least one report describing a preliminary magnitude 5.7 in the Scotia Sea appears to be describing the same event that was later revised upward to 6.2 as more stations reported and the solution was refined. Under that reading, there was one earthquake this morning. The 5.7 is not a separate event at all. It is the ghost of an early automatic solution that got superseded, still circulating in aggregated feeds after the number it referred to had already changed. These two readings are not close to each other in meaning. One of them describes a fault producing a sequence. The other describes a fault producing a single event, and a reporting pipeline producing an artifact. And I cannot tell you today which one is correct. What I can tell you is that this will be settled within days by the reviewed catalogue and not by anyone's intuition. A human analyst will work through the waveforms, and the final catalogue entry will either contain 2 events or 1. That is how this gets resolved. It gets resolved by somebody doing the work carefully after the fact. I want to use this to explain something about how earthquake information reaches you, because I think it is the most useful piece of media literacy I can offer, and it will change how you read every one of these events for the rest of your life. When the ground moves, the seismic waves travel outward. The fastest of them, the compressional P waves, move through the crust at roughly 6 kilometres per second. Within a couple of minutes, they reach the nearest stations of the global network. Within about 10 to 20 minutes, they have reached stations on the far side of the planet. Automated systems are watching those arrivals continuously. As soon as enough stations have reported, an algorithm picks the arrival times, solves for a location, estimates a magnitude, and publishes. This whole process can complete in under 5 minutes. That first solution is built on whichever stations happen to report first, which for a Southern Ocean earthquake means a thin and geometrically awkward set. It is genuinely the best that can be done in 5 minutes, and for the purpose it serves, which is a rapid heads-up, it is remarkable. But it is provisional by design. Over the following minutes and hours, more stations report. The solution is recomputed with better geometry. Magnitude estimates from different methods, which weight different parts of the seismic signal, are compared. A moment tensor is calculated. Eventually a human being reviews all of it. At each step the numbers can move, and they frequently do in both directions. So a magnitude that changes from 5.7 to 6.2 is not a correction of an error. It is the process working exactly as designed. The alarming scenario would be a number that never moved at all. I labour this because the revision is reliably misread. Every single time a magnitude gets adjusted, a certain reading of it appears within the hour. They changed the number, they are hiding the real size, they downgraded it to keep people calm. And I understand where that instinct comes from. Institutions have concealed things. Skepticism about official figures is not an unreasonable default. But apply the test that any conspiracy has to survive, which is whether it is even possible. Seismic data is not proprietary. Waveforms from hundreds of stations worldwide are published openly, in near real time, and are downloaded constantly by university groups, national agencies and hobbyists with laptops. Anyone with the software can compute their own magnitude. A systematically falsified figure from one agency would be visible as a discrepancy against everyone else's solution within hours. The openness of the data is precisely what makes suppression impractical. And notice which direction this particular revision went. If there were an institutional bias toward calming people down, you would expect magnitudes to drift downward under review. This one went up. There is a second check available in this specific case that I think closes the question entirely. 2 independent organisations reported this earthquake: the Geological Survey in the United States and the European Mediterranean Seismological Centre. They run different station networks, use overlapping but not identical data, apply their own processing chains, and answer to different governments on different continents. They both arrived at magnitude 6.2. They both arrived at 10 kilometres depth. For that agreement to be manufactured, you would need coordination between agencies in different jurisdictions with different funding, different staff and no shared incentive, over a magnitude 6 earthquake in an empty ocean that harmed nobody and damaged nothing. There is no story in which that effort makes sense. The simplest explanation for 2 independent groups getting the same answer is that the answer is right. The same logic applies to the depth. I mentioned earlier that 10 kilometres is a fixed default the Geological Survey uses when depth is poorly constrained, and that the reviewed solution for this event came in near 11.5 kilometres. That is a revision of 1.5 kilometres in the direction of slightly deeper, on a quantity that was explicitly flagged as poorly constrained in the first place. It is a refinement. It is what the arrival of better information looks like. There is a broader point buried in here about how much of what we know is provisional in exactly this way. Everything I have said about this earthquake, the magnitude, the depth, the near vertical fault planes, the epicenter coordinates that produced my 67-kilometre figure, all of it is subject to revision as the analysis matures. The 67 kilometres could become 60 or 75. The dips of 87 and 84 degrees could shift by a few degrees. Would any of that change the story? Not really, and I think it is worth saying why. The argument does not depend on precision. It depends on the fact that this event happened on a mapped plate boundary segment with a demonstrated capacity for magnitude 7.6 to 7.8 ruptures on the western side of the most recent one. Whether the offset is 60 kilometres or 75 kilometres, that remains true. The place where the revision genuinely matters is the 5.7, because if the reviewed catalogue confirms a separate event 7 3/4 hours before the main one, then the parallel to November 2013 gets considerably stronger. It would mean the fault produced two significant events in a day, which is the beginning of the structure that the 2013 sequence had, and if instead the 5.7 dissolves into a superseded preliminary solution, then today was a single event and there is nothing to build on. That is a real question, with a real answer that will arrive shortly. Which brings us to the most practical part of this entire video, because there is a specific and short list of things to watch, and every item on it is checkable by anyone with a browser. Part 10. 4 things to watch. I dislike telling people that something is worth watching without telling them what watching actually consists of. So here is the list. 4 things. Every one of them can be checked against a public earthquake catalogue by anyone, and every one of them will either strengthen or dismantle the case that today mattered. The first thing to watch is whether the aftershocks spread along the boundary or stay put. In November 2013, 20 aftershocks between magnitude 4.6 and 5.3 occurred within 8 hours of the main shock, and they aligned along the plate boundary. That alignment is normal. An aftershock zone maps the rupture that produced it, and its length gives you a rough sense of the size of the thing that moved. What is not normal, and what would be genuinely significant, is migration. If over the coming days the activity does not simply cluster and decay, but progressively steps along the fault trace, moving away from where it started rather than dying where it started, that is the signature of stress being handed from one segment to the next. That is the physical process the British Antarctic Survey was describing when it used the phrase domino effect. Watch the map, not the count. A tight cluster that fades is one story. A line of events walking east or west along the boundary is a completely different one. The second thing to watch is the magnitude ceiling, and this one comes with a specific number attached, which makes it the most useful item on the list. There is an empirical relationship in seismology called Barth's law, which observes that the largest aftershock in a sequence tends to be about 1.2 magnitude units smaller than the main shock. It is not a physical law in any deep sense. It is a robust statistical regularity observed across enormous numbers of sequences worldwide, and it holds well enough to be useful. Apply it here. If this morning's magnitude 6.2 was a main shock, then the expected largest aftershock is around magnitude 5.0. That is the prediction the standard model makes. So here is your threshold. Events up to around magnitude 5, decaying in frequency over the following days, mean this behaved like an ordinary main shock and the story is over. Repeated events above magnitude 5.5, and especially anything approaching or exceeding 6.2 itself, mean the sequence is not behaving like a main shock and its aftershocks. It is behaving like something still building. I like this item because it converts a vague sense of unease into a number you can check. You do not need to interpret a mood. You look at whether anything above 5.5 shows up. There is a companion relationship worth knowing alongside it called Omori's law, which describes how aftershock rates decay. Roughly speaking, the rate falls off as 1 over the elapsed time since the main shock. Half as many on the second day as on the first. A third as many on the third day. It is a steep drop and it is remarkably consistent. A sequence that decays on that schedule is behaving textbook. A sequence whose rate stays flat, or climbs, is not. There is a second reason the spatial extent matters, and it is one of the more elegant relationships in the field. The length of a rupture scales with its magnitude, because magnitude is fundamentally a measure of how much fault area moved and by how much. A magnitude 6 is typically a rupture of order 10 to 15 kilometres in length. A magnitude 7 is order 50 to 100. A magnitude 8 can run for hundreds of kilometres. Now recall that the affected zone in November 2013 was assessed at approximately 300 kilometres of plate boundary. That is not a magnitude 6-sized problem. That is a fault system responding across a distance appropriate to the event that produced it. So when you are watching the aftershock zone develop over the coming days, you are not just watching for movement. You are watching how long the active zone becomes, and that length is a direct readout of how much of this boundary is currently participating. An active zone that stays 10 or 15 kilometres across is consistent with a single magnitude 6.2 and nothing more. An active zone that grows to 50 or 100 kilometres is telling you that considerably more of the fault has been woken up than one moderate earthquake accounts for. The third thing to watch is whether the focal mechanisms stay consistent. Every earthquake above a certain size gets a moment tensor computed, so you can check the mechanism of each new event as it appears. If the subsequent events show the same near-vertical strike-slip geometry as this morning's, with dips in the 80s and rakes near horizontal, then they are all failures on the same structure, and you are watching a single fault system respond. If instead the mechanisms start varying, with different orientations or a mix of strike-slip and normal faulting appearing, that indicates something more diffuse, a region of crust responding across multiple structures rather than one fault working through a problem. Given the transtensional character of this boundary and the mechanism dispute over the 2003 event, a mixture of mechanisms is entirely possible here, and it would be genuinely informative. The fourth thing to watch is the direction, and this is the one that ties back to everything we established about complementary slip. If activity migrates east toward the 2013 rupture zone, that is one story. That would be the fault poking at ground that has already been released, which is what aftershock zones do at their edges, and it would be unremarkable. If activity migrates west, away from the 2013 rupture, and into the segment beyond it, that is a different story entirely. That would be seismicity moving into ground that has not been released in the instrumental record, on a boundary where the published model has successive large ruptures filling adjacent unbroken patches. There is a fifth thing you can look at if you want to go a step further, and it is the relationship that underpins all of the others. Earthquakes obey a strikingly consistent size distribution. For every one earthquake of a given magnitude in a region, there are roughly 10 of 1 magnitude units smaller, 100 2 units smaller, 1,000 3 units smaller. It holds across regions, across time periods, and across scales, and it is one of the most reliable statistical patterns in the earth sciences. The practical use of it is that it lets you sanity check a sequence. If this morning's magnitude 6.2 is a main shock with a normal aftershock sequence, the distribution of what follows should look ordinary. Many small events, a handful of moderate ones, one around magnitude 5, and nothing above. What is interesting is when a sequence stops obeying it. If a region produces an unusual excess of larger events relative to smaller ones, the distribution has flattened, and a flattened distribution is generally interpreted as indicating high differential stress in the rock volume. It is one of the very few things you can extract about the stress state of a fault from the earthquake catalogue alone, which on a boundary with no other instruments is worth having. I raise it not because I expect anyone at home to be computing this, but because it illustrates the position we are in. On a fault with no geodesy, the earthquake catalogue is not merely the record of what happened, it is the only instrument. Every question we would like to ask about the state of this boundary has to be squeezed out of the pattern of its own failures, and that is a very thin thread to hang a hazard assessment on. I want to be careful about what I am doing here, because it would be easy to dress this up as a prediction, and it is not one. Every item on this list is a diagnostic, not a forecast. Most likely outcome by a wide margin. The aftershocks stay clustered, nothing exceeds magnitude 5, the mechanisms stay consistent, the sequence decays on schedule, and by the middle of September this is a line in a catalogue. That is what usually happens because that is what usually happens. But the reason I am giving you a checklist rather than a conclusion goes back to the thing that has been sitting underneath this entire video, and it is worth saying once more in a different form. On a fault in California or Japan, you would not need any of this. You would look at the geodetic network. You would see whether the crust around this segment had been deforming, which segments were locked, how much slip deficit had accumulated. You would answer the question with instruments rather than inference. Out here there is no network, there is no strain measurement, and there is no way to look at the fault directly. The aftershock sequence is not one line of evidence among several, it is the only line of evidence there is. Which is why watching what happens over the next week is not a matter of idle interest, it is the entire method. And there is one more thing on the map from this morning that I have deliberately not explained yet, because almost every piece of coverage is going to get it wrong, and getting it right is the difference between understanding this region and just looking at dots. Because there was a third earthquake today, and it does not belong in this story at all. Part 11. The Third Earthquake. If you pulled up a map of today's seismic activity in the far South Atlantic, you would have seen 3 dots, and I suspect a lot of coverage this week is going to treat those 3 dots as one story. Two of them we have discussed. The third is well to the east, in the South Sandwich Islands region, and it registered magnitude 5.4. Now, at a glance, that looks like confirmation of something. 3 earthquakes, same corner of the world, same day, and the phrase that immediately suggests itself is swarm. The region is lighting up. Something is happening across the whole system. Look at the depth, and that reading falls apart completely. That third earthquake occurred at approximately 159 kilometres below the seafloor, nearly 100 miles down. Compare that to the events we have been discussing, at 10 and 11.5 kilometres. The eastern event is roughly 15 times deeper, and that is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind, because at 159 kilometres, you're not in the crust at all. You are well down inside the mantle, and the physics of how rock fails down there is not the physics of a fault sliding in the upper crust. Here is why that matters, and it is one of the genuinely strange facts about the interior of this planet. Earthquakes, as most people understand them, are brittle failures. Rock under stress reaches its breaking strength, snaps, and the two sides slide. That works fine near the surface, where rock is cold and brittle, and behaves the way a dinner plate behaves. But as you go deeper, temperature and pressure both climb steeply, and by a few tens of kilometres down, ordinary rock stops being brittle. It becomes ductile. Under enough heat and confining pressure, it flows rather than snapping, like putty rather than porcelain. So by rights, earthquakes should not be possible below about 50 or 60 kilometres, and yet they happen routinely down to 600 kilometres or more. That was one of the outstanding puzzles of 20th century geophysics, and the answer, when it came, was one of the great confirmations of plate tectonics. Deep earthquakes only occur in one setting, inside slabs of oceanic lithosphere that are descending into the mantle at subduction zones. The reason they can occur there is that the sinking slab is cold. It carries the temperature of the seafloor down with it, and it takes millions of years to warm up to the temperature of its surroundings. So there is a cold, brittle sheet of rock plunging through hot ductile mantle, and inside that sheet, brittle-style failure remains possible far below the depth where the surrounding material would simply flow. The mechanisms are debated and probably involve mineral phase changes and dehydration of trapped water, rather than straightforward frictional sliding, but the setting is not in dispute. It is worth appreciating just how strange the deep earthquake population is, because it puts today's event in proportion. Deep events are not evenly distributed with depth. Their frequency falls off sharply below about 300 kilometres, reaches a minimum somewhere around 400 to 500, and then rises again towards 600 before stopping almost completely just past that. Below roughly 700 kilometres, earthquakes essentially do not occur anywhere on Earth. That cutoff is not arbitrary. It sits close to the base of the mantle transition zone, the depth at which the minerals making up the sinking slab reorganize into denser structures. Whatever mechanism allows brittle-style failure to persist inside a cold slab appears to switch off once those transformations are complete. The slab keeps going down. It just stops making earthquakes. The point of that detour is scale. There is an entire seismic world operating beneath the one that affects us, obeying different rules, driven by different physics, and almost completely disconnected from what happens in the top 10 kilometres of crust, where every damaging earthquake in human history has originated. A 159-kilometre event and a 10-kilometre event are neighbours only on a flat map. The practical consequence is that a deep earthquake is a signature. When you see an event at 159 kilometres, you're looking at a slab. You're being told by the depth alone that there is subducting lithosphere beneath that point. So this third earthquake is not an event on the transform boundary we have been discussing. It is an event inside the descending plate of the South Sandwich subduction system, a completely different tectonic environment, at 15 times the depth, more than 1,000 kilometres away. Could a rupture on the South Scotia Ridge influence a slab event 1,000 kilometres east at 100 miles depth? There is no mechanism that makes that plausible. Static stress transfer, the mechanism behind the domino effect we discussed earlier, falls off sharply with distance. It is a local phenomenon, meaningful over tens of kilometres, not over 1,000 kilometres, and through the mantle. I'm spending time on this because the word swarm is going to get used a great deal this week, and it is the wrong word twice over. A A swarm technically is a cluster of earthquakes with no clear main shock. Lots of events of comparable size, arriving over hours or days or weeks, with no single dominant rupture that the others obviously relate to. They're common in volcanic settings where magma movement is fracturing rock across a region and in geothermal areas. We actually have a live example running right now, on the other side of the world, and the contrast is instructive. In southern Spain, near Granada, a seismic sequence has produced more than 620 earthquakes, with roughly 600 residents evacuated. That is a swarm. Hundreds of events, densely clustered in space and time, no single dominant rupture, ongoing. Today in the Scotia Sea we had at most 2 events on one fault, plus one unrelated event 1,000 kilometres away in a different tectonic environment at 15 times the depth. That is not a swarm. It is not the same phenomenon, it does not have the same causes, and calling it one obscures the thing that actually makes today interesting. And this matters for the central question, rather than being a pedantic aside. If you lump all 3 events together and call it a regional swarm, you have already answered the question the wrong way. A swarm is diffuse. It is a region of crust responding across many structures, and it usually means the individual events are less significant, not more. The story here is precisely the opposite. It is a very specific thing happening at a very specific point on a very specific fault segment with a very specific history, and it only holds any weight at all when you keep it that narrow. Blur it into a regional swarm and you have destroyed the only reason to care. But while we are looking east, I do want to spend some real time on that subduction system, because it is not a footnote. It is the other end of the same tectonic bridge, and in 2021 it did something that almost nobody heard about, and that everybody should have. Part 12. The Other End of the Bridge. The South Sandwich Islands are a chain of small volcanic islands in the far South Atlantic, and by almost any measure they are one of the most remote inhabited adjacent places on the planet, which is to say, nobody lives there at all. They exist for the same reason all volcanic arcs exist. Just to their east lies the South Sandwich Trench, where the South American plate is descending beneath the small Sandwich Plate. As that slab sinks, water trapped in its minerals is driven off, that water lowers the melting point of the mantle above it, melt rises, and a line of volcanoes appears parallel to the trench. The islands are the visible tip of that process. The trench itself is worth a moment, because most people have never heard of it, and it is genuinely one of the great features of the ocean floor. The South Sandwich Trench reaches depths of more than 8,000 metres. Its deepest measured point, known as the Meteor Deep, sits at something over 8,200 metres below the surface, which makes it the deepest point in the entire Southern Ocean and the deepest anywhere in the Atlantic system. 8,200 metres. If you dropped the highest mountain in the Alps into that trench, the summit would still be several kilometres underwater. It is not one of the famous trenches. It does not have the name recognition of the Mariana. And that anonymity is a reasonable proxy for how the whole region gets treated. This is one of the most extreme pieces of seafloor topography anywhere on Earth, sitting at the eastern end of the same plate system that produced this morning's earthquake, and almost nobody outside the field could point to it on a map. The convergence rate there is 70 to 78 millimetres per year in a west-southwest direction. Sit with that number next to the one we have been using all video. The transform boundary that produced this morning's earthquake moves at something like 7 to 11 millimetres per year. The subduction zone at the eastern edge of the same plate system moves at 70 to 78, one plate system, 2 edges, a factor of 10 between them. That is worth understanding rather than just noting, because it explains why the 2 ends of this bridge behave so differently. Faster convergence means strain accumulates faster, which means more frequent large earthquakes and a busier catalogue. The South Sandwich region produces significant earthquakes routinely. There was a magnitude 6.0 there just 10 days ago, on the 12th of August. The transform we are discussing produces a magnitude 7.6 or 7.8 roughly, as far as our short record can tell, twice in 23 years. Now let me tell you what happened on the 12th of August 2021, because it is one of the most remarkable earthquakes of the last decade, and it went almost entirely unnoticed by the public, for the straightforward reason that it happened when nobody was. At 35 minutes and 20 seconds past 1800 hours, universal time, an earthquake of magnitude 8.1 occurred at the South Sandwich subduction zone. 3 minutes earlier, and about 90 kilometres away, a magnitude 7.5 had struck. 3 minutes. Consider what that interval means for anyone trying to interpret events in real time. A magnitude 7.5 is a major earthquake by any standard. Automated systems would have picked it up, produced a solution, and begun pushing alerts. And before those alerts had finished propagating, something 10 times larger in energy terms occurred 90 kilometres away. The main shock itself was extraordinary in its structure. The fault surface that ruptured extended over 450 kilometres and was strongly curved, striking anywhere from 150 to 220 degrees, depending on where along the rupture you measured. It took roughly 180 seconds to complete. 3 minutes of continuous rupture. Somewhere out there in the dark, a crack 450 kilometres long propagated through the crust for 3 solid minutes. And the character of that rupture is what makes it scientifically important. Published analysis describes it as multimodal, proceeding in distinct stages. An initial sub-event rupturing about 180 kilometres along the plate interface, with further sub-events of magnitude 7.6 and 7.7 occurring 250 and 300 kilometres to the south. The critical part is that the largest and shallowest phase was a slow rupture, and it released roughly 70% of the total seismic moment. Slow rupture is a category that deserves proper explanation, because it is the mechanism behind some of the deadliest surprises in the history of this field. Most earthquakes radiate energy efficiently across a broad range of frequencies, including the high frequencies that shake buildings and that magnitude scales are calibrated to detect quickly. But some ruptures, particularly shallow ones on the outermost part of a subduction interface where the sediments are weak and waterlogged, propagate slowly and radiate very little high-frequency energy. They still displace an enormous volume of seafloor. They still move an enormous amount of water. They just do not shake very hard, and the automated magnitude estimates that arrive in the first minutes systematically underestimate them. These are called tsunami earthquakes, and the defining feature is that the wave is far larger than the shaking suggested it should be. The 1992 Nicaragua event is the textbook case. Mild shaking on the coast, and then a tsunami that killed well over 100 people who had felt no reason to move. The 2021 South Sandwich earthquake was one of these, and it generated a tsunami that spread across the global ocean. From the Antarctic, waves propagated all the way to the far northeastern corner of the Pacific. It was detected on tide gauges an ocean away, and it happened because 70% of the moment was released in a slow, quiet phase that the early solutions barely registered. Nobody died because there was nobody there. That is the only reason this is a scientific curiosity rather than a catastrophe, and the way that tsunami was actually detected tells you something about how thin the global safety net is in the southern hemisphere. There was no coastal population to report it, because there is no coastal population. The wave was tracked instead by deep ocean pressure sensors sitting on the seafloor, which measure the weight of the water column above them and can pick out a tsunami passing overhead, as a change of a few centimetres in a water column several kilometres deep, and by tide gauges on distant islands and coastlines as the wave arrived hours later. Think about what that means operationally. The first indication that something had gone badly wrong came not from the shaking, which was underreported by the early magnitude solutions, and not from any observer near the source because there were none. It came from instruments in the open ocean noticing that the sea itself had changed height by a few centimetres. That is the margin by which that event was correctly characterised at all. Now extend that thought to the boundary we have been discussing all evening. If the South Sandwich system, which is comparatively well studied and sits inside a functioning tsunami warning framework, could produce an event that underreported its own size for the first several minutes, ask yourself what the detection situation looks like on a transformed boundary in the Southern Ocean, with no geodetic network at all. The islands themselves are worth a moment too because they are part of the same machinery. The South Sandwich Arc includes some of the most persistently active and least observed volcanoes on the planet. Several of them have been in near-continuous eruptive activity for years at a time, and much of what is known about their behaviour comes from satellite thermal imagery rather than anyone on the ground, because getting to them is a serious expedition in its own right. That is the pattern across this entire region. The processes are large, the instruments are few, and most of our knowledge arrives late and from a distance. And this ties directly back to the fault we have been watching all video, in a way that I think closes a loop. The reassurance about this morning's earthquake was mechanical, horizontal motion, no vertical seafloor displacement, no tsunami, and that reassurance holds for this event. But look at what the same plate system demonstrated at its eastern edge. A rupture that underreported its own size in the first minutes, that released most of its energy in a phase the early instruments barely saw, and that sent waves across an entire ocean. The Scotia system is capable of surprises at both ends. At the eastern end, it produced an earthquake that was much larger than it initially appeared. At the western end, on our transform, the 2003 event appears to have failed with vertical displacement rather than horizontal, on a boundary I have described to you all evening as a strike-slip margin. So the honest summary is not that this plate system is dangerous. It is that this plate system is underobserved and repeatedly surprising, and those two things are related. Which brings us to the question I promised you at the start, the one I know a lot of you have been sitting on, and it is about South America. Part 13, the question about South America. Given everything that has happened over the last 2 weeks, this question is not just reasonable, it is the right question to ask, and I want to answer it properly rather than dismissively. August has been loud. On the 10th, a magnitude 7.4 struck Choco, in Colombia, and the toll from that event has now passed 280 dead. On the 14th, a magnitude 7.7 hit the Flores region of Indonesia, killing at least 47. On the 15th, a magnitude 6.9 in North Sumatra. On the 20th, a magnitude 6.7 in Ayacucho, Peru, which we looked at on this channel 2 days ago. And now this. Before I answer, look at how differently those events behaved compared with this one, because the contrast is the answer in miniature. The Flores event on the 14th occurred at about 10 kilometres depth, roughly 68 kilometres north-northwest of Ende, in East Nusa Tenggara. Same depth as this morning's earthquake, nearly identical in fact, and yet it killed at least 47 people, triggered a tsunami warning, and was followed by aftershocks at magnitude 6.1, 5.9, 5.6 and 5.5. The difference is not depth, and it is not really magnitude either, although 1.5 magnitude units is a great deal of energy. The difference is mechanism and setting. That was a thrust event in a subduction environment, in an archipelago where millions of people live within a few tens of kilometres of the coast. Vertical seafloor displacement, populated coastline, immediate tsunami concern. This morning was horizontal displacement in an empty ocean. 2 shallow earthquakes, 8 days apart, and one of them is a humanitarian disaster, while the other is a line in a catalogue that I am spending 2 hours on for entirely different reasons. What determines that outcome is not how violent the earthquake was, it is which direction the rock moved and who happened to be standing nearby. That is worth sitting with, because it is the whole of earthquake hazard in one comparison. So, could the earthquakes in South America have anything to do with what happened in the Scotia Sea this morning? There is a fascinating connection here, and also an important distinction, and I want to give you both, in that order, because the connection is real and the distinction is what actually answers the question. The connection first. The Scotia system genuinely does link the tectonics of southern South America to those of Antarctica. That is not a metaphor. The boundaries of the Scotia plate wrap around from Tierra del Fuego, at the very southern tip of the continent, out through the Scotia Sea and around toward the South Sandwich Arc. There is a continuous structural pathway from South America to Antarctica, and this morning's earthquake happened on it. When people say these two continents are tectonically connected, they are correct, and this fault is the connection. Now the distinction, and it is decisive. The large earthquakes further north, in Colombia and Peru, and along that entire margin, do not occur on this system. They occur on the boundary between the Nazca Plate and the South American Plate, which is a subduction zone running down the western side of the continent. On the Pacific side, different plates, different boundary, different mechanism, and in the Peruvian case, radically different depth. That event on the 20th occurred at 99 kilometres, well down inside the descending Nazca slab, which, as we established earlier, is a completely different failure environment from a shallow crustal transform. So the pathway exists, but the earthquakes are not on it. They are on the other side of a continent, on an unconnected boundary, in a different tectonic regime. Now, can one huge earthquake disturb faults thousands of kilometres away? Yes. That is real, it is documented, and it has a name, which is dynamic triggering. The mechanism is different from the static stress transfer we discussed earlier. Static transfer is about permanent redistribution of stress in the crust around a rupture, and it drops off sharply with distance. Dynamic triggering is about the seismic waves themselves. As surface waves from a large earthquake sweep across the planet, they briefly deform the crust they pass through, and that transient deformation can push a fault that was already critically loaded over the edge. This has been observed clearly. The largest earthquakes have produced small triggered events at enormous distances as their waves passed. But look carefully at the properties of that phenomenon, because they are what disqualify it here. Dynamic triggering acts during the wave train. The waves take tens of minutes to circle the planet, and the triggering effect is largely confined to that window and the hours immediately following. It is not a mechanism that delivers an earthquake 12 days after the event that supposedly caused it. It also has a strong preference. Triggered events cluster overwhelmingly in geothermal fields and volcanic systems, where fluids are present and the crust is close to failure across a broad region. A slow oceanic transform in the Southern Ocean is not that kind of environment, and it triggers small things. Microseismicity mostly. The literature does not support magnitude 6.2 ruptures being conjured by passing surface waves from a continent away. So, there is no evidence that the South American earthquakes caused this. And here is the part I actually want to land, because I think it is the more interesting version of the answer. We do not need them to. The fault underneath this morning's earthquake is entirely sufficient to explain this morning's earthquake. It is a plate boundary with a measured slip rate, accumulating strain continuously, that has produced two events near magnitude 7.6 and 7.8 in the last 23 years without any help from anywhere. Reaching across a continent for an explanation actually diminishes the story, because it implies this boundary needs a trigger, and it does not. It has been loading for centuries on its own. The same logic disposes of the wider version of this idea, which is the one that says the whole planet is unlocking and these events are links in a chain. Run it against the base rate. Roughly 15 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater occur worldwide in an average year. That is more than one a month on average, and averages are not schedules. Clusters happen. A month with 4 is above the mean and comfortably inside normal variance, and it feels like a pattern, for the same reason that 4 heads in a row feels like a loaded coin. There is an energy argument underneath that base rate point which I think makes it concrete rather than statistical, and it is the one that finally settled this question for me. For a distant earthquake to cause another earthquake, it has to deliver energy to that fault. Seismic energy spreads outward from a source in 3 dimensions, and its amplitude falls off steeply with distance. By the time surface waves from a magnitude 7 have travelled several thousand kilometres, the ground motion they produce is measured in fractions of a millimetre. It is enough to register on a sensitive instrument. It is not enough to do work on a fault that is not already at the absolute edge. Meanwhile, the stress that actually breaks a fault has been delivered by plate motion, continuously, for centuries. 9 millimetres a year, every year, without pause, for 300 or 400 years, is the budget that produced the 2013 earthquake. Compare that to a transient wobble lasting a few tens of seconds as a wave train passes. The plate motion is not a contributing factor competing with other contributing factors. It is the entire budget. Everything else is noise on top of it. We ran into exactly this reasoning in June, when a magnitude 7.2 and a magnitude 7.5 struck Venezuela hours apart, and a Japanese event and a Californian one landed in the same window, and the internet assembled all of them into one global event. The answer then was the same as the answer now. Those earthquakes were on separate boundaries, driven by separate plate motions, each with its own centuries-long loading history, and their arrival within one night of each other was a property of the calendar rather than a property of the Earth. I will give the same treatment to the other explanation that arrives with every earthquake now, which is the sun. We went through this in detail 2 days ago with the Peruvian event, so I will keep it short. The energy delivered to the crust by even a strong geomagnetic storm is orders of magnitude below what is required to advance a fault toward failure, and geomagnetically induced currents are a near-surface phenomenon that does not reach into the seismogenic zone in any meaningful way. Beyond that, this fault produced a magnitude 7.8 in 2013 without any solar peg attached, and it has a measured slip rate that fully accounts for the strain it releases. The plates already explain it, and there is a version of the ice sheet argument that shows up for anything happening near Antarctica, which deserves the same courtesy. Glacial unloading is a real process that does produce seismicity where ice sheets have retreated, because removing a kilometre of ice removes an enormous load from the crust beneath it, and the crust rebounds. But this earthquake was offshore, in oceanic and transitional crust well north of the ice sheet, on a mapped transform boundary with a known slip rate, and its motion was horizontal, which is not what rebound produces. The ice explanation is searching for a cause when the boundary is already holding one. Every one of these alternatives is an attempt to import a cause from outside, and the thing they all have in common is that they are reaching past a fault that is entirely capable of doing this by itself. Which leaves us where we started, with a boundary nobody is watching, and one small building that has been sitting beside it for longer than anyone reading. This has been alive. Part 14, 1904. In 1903, the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition under the leadership of William Spears Bruce built a stone hut on Laurie Island in the South Orkneys. On the 22nd of February 1904, that hut was handed over to Argentine explorers. They have operated it, under the name Orcadas, ever since. It is the oldest research station in Antarctica still in operation, and it has been permanently populated continuously since 1904. Not seasonally, not intermittently. Every single winter for more than 120 years, somebody has been down there. It sits 4 metres above sea level and roughly 170 metres from the shoreline. Its nearest neighbour is Sydney, the British station we discussed earlier, about 51 kilometres away, which is empty right now because it is the middle of the austral winter. And there is a detail here that I find hard to get past. The Scotia Sea itself is named after the expedition ship that brought Bruce and his people here between 1902 and 1904. The name was formalised in 1932, so the water is named after the voyage that built the hut that became the longest continuously occupied human presence on the entire continent, sitting beside a plate boundary that, at the time, nobody knew existed. There is something else about Orcadas that I think deserves to be said, because it changes what that building is. Because somebody has been there every single year since 1904, that station holds the longest continuous scientific observation record anywhere in Antarctica. Weather readings, taken by hand and later by instrument, day after day, through more than a century of winters, in a place where almost nothing else has been observed continuously at all. Almost everything we understand about long-term change in that sector of the Southern Ocean rests to some degree on that record, because there is no other record of comparable length, and it exists for an almost accidental reason. A Scottish expedition ran out of money and time, built a hut, and rather than abandon it, handed it to a government willing to keep somebody in it. That decision, made in February of 1904 for entirely practical reasons, produced one of the most valuable data sets on the continent. I find that a useful thing to hold next to everything else in this video. We have spent 2 hours on a plate boundary that we cannot measure, whose behaviour we can only reconstruct after it acts, where the instruments that would answer our questions do not exist. And the single longest continuous scientific record in Antarctica comes from a stone hut that was put up beside that same fault by people who had no idea it was there, and kept going by people who simply decided not to leave. Plate tectonics as a theory would not be accepted for another 60 years. The people who put that hut on Laurie Island had no concept of a plate boundary, no idea that the seafloor to their north was a transform fault, and no way to know that the ground they had chosen would produce, within the lifetime of their station, the largest earthquakes ever recorded in that ocean. The distances involved this morning are not dramatic, and I want to give you accurate ones rather than alarming ones, because I have seen some numbers circulating today that I cannot reproduce. Working directly from the published epicentre coordinates, Sydney sits roughly 115 kilometres from this morning's rupture, and Orcadas roughly 160. Some of the outlying rocks and islets of the group are closer than that. But this earthquake was not on top of anybody, and I am not going to pretend it was, and I want to correct something I said earlier, or at least sharpen it, because there is a detail about that station that matters, and I do not want to leave you with a cleaner story than the truth supports. Orcadas is not just a weather station. Its listed research programs include continental glaciology, sea ice zone glaciology, meteorology, and seismology. Seismology. There is a seismic station on the South Orkney Islands, and it has been there for a very long time, so when I told you there is no instrument on this plate, I need to be precise about what I meant, because the distinction is the whole point. There are seismometers. A seismometer records ground motion. It tells you with great accuracy that an earthquake has happened, where it happened, and how large it was. What it cannot do is tell you how much strain has accumulated on a fault that has not broken yet. The instrument that does that is a permanent satellite positioning receiver, measuring the slow deformation of the crust between earthquakes, and that is what a geodetic network is. Seismology observes failures. Geodesy observes the loading that leads to them. So the accurate statement is this. This plate boundary is listened to. It is not watched. We hear it when it breaks, from a station on Laurie Island and from hundreds of stations around the world, and we hear it very well. What nobody can do is see it filling up in between. What today was near enough that somebody almost certainly felt it, which is the smallest possible human fact in this entire story, and I keep coming back to it. The winter crew at Orcadas typically numbers somewhere around 17 people. 17 people, in the oldest continuously inhabited outpost on the continent, 4 metres above sea level and 170 metres from the water in the middle of the polar night. They very likely felt the buildings move this morning in the dark, and the instrument in their seismology program certainly recorded it. In 2013, when the fault produced its largest recorded event, there was nobody at Signy to feel anything, and the survey's assessment was essentially that they would find out what had happened when the ship arrived. That is not a criticism of anyone. It is what monitoring a plate boundary at the bottom of the world actually looks like in practice. And it is the same situation this morning, which brings this all the way back to where we began. We are looking at a plate we cannot see. There is no geodetic network standing on the Scotia plate. Every published figure for how fast it moves was derived by listening to it break from thousands of kilometres away and reasoning backwards. We do not know which segments are locked and which are creeping. We do not know how much strain has accumulated on the ground west of the 2013 rupture, because there is no instrument out there that could tell us. So the fault has exactly one way to communicate, and this morning it used it. A magnitude 6.2, 67 kilometres west of the largest earthquake this ocean has ever produced, on a boundary where the published model says successive large ruptures fill in the ground beside each other rather than repeating, and where a National Research Institute stated in public more than a decade ago that events of exactly this type can destabilise the segments next door. We have one word and no way to know whether it is the beginning of a sentence or the end of one. Everything about this story is retrospective by construction. The label Foreshock only exists after the fact. The complementary slip pattern was only visible once both earthquakes had happened. The fault's capability was only established by the fault demonstrating it. We are permanently reading this boundary backwards, and the only reason we know anything at all about it is that it has occasionally shouted. Which is why the thing I am actually going to be watching over the next several days is not the dramatic scenario. I do not expect a magnitude 8. I do not expect a chain reaction rippling around the planet. What I expect, honestly, is a quiet decay, a scatter of small aftershocks, and nothing. But there is one specific thing I want to know before anything else, and it is smaller and stranger than any of the big questions. I want to know whether that magnitude 5.7 was real. Because if the reviewed catalogue comes back in a few days and confirms 2 separate earthquakes this morning, 7 hours and 42 minutes apart on the same stretch of fault, then this boundary has already done, in a single day, the first thing the 2013 sequence did. And if instead that number dissolves into a superseded preliminary solution, then today was one earthquake in an empty ocean, and it means nothing at all. The same set of waveforms, the same morning, the same fault, and 2 completely different stories. Somebody is going to sit down with that data and work it out, and until they do, the only honest thing anyone can say about what happened beneath Antarctica this morning is that we are waiting to find out whether we saw 1 earthquake or 2.